And my Facebook page is the Chris Marino, if that matters.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Tabman, and welcome to Crimes and Times. Lately, as you watch the news, and we're discussing here, everything is about Trump and Russia and about opposition research, otherwise known as Oppo research, one candidate spying on another. What's it all about? What does it mean? And how it's done? Tonight, we have a very special guest who's going to help us get some insight into that. We have with us Chris Moreno, who has done opposition research for a living, so he knows what he's talking about. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, if you can, just speak a little louder so your mic can pick you up better, a little low. Chris, tell us a little bit about opposition research. Broadly, what is it? How does it work? And how did you find yourself getting involved in it?
Opposition research broadly is just it's a effort to break apart the opponent of a political candidate or organization, starting with who they are, all the way down to any errors they may have had in their life. So, in a nutshell, how I got started in it was just my degrees in political science, and I quickly became very good at the research part of it, and have a keen sense of where there's smoke, there's fire, and going down the rabbit hole.
Interesting. Now, Chris, I've known you for a couple of years. I don't know you very well, but you strike me as a really nice guy, someone who wouldn't want to hurt anybody. Do you have any reservations about doing that, about sort of being sneaky and finding out stuff about people they don't want you to find out?
I do not have reservations about it. Here's the thing is the purpose of it is to know who you're going against. Campaigns or battles, and it's to know who you're going against. And quite honestly, in a lot of instances, in most instances, it does a service to the public. So what a lot of folks see from opposition research are the negative, nasty ads every campaign season on every channel you can think of. But on the other side, there's also a lot of cases where there's some dark history in people's background that gets exposed from that, and because of that, those folks then are disqualified from office or do not get elected.
What about some of the personal nasty things that may not disqualify somebody, or in your personal opinion, you feel, well, I don't think that's so relevant, I don't think that should be out there. Do you ever make a judgment call as to whether to release information to your client or not, or do you just give them everything they have, or that you have, rather?
So when I've been hired in the past, it's everything is done on a factual basis. So what's not include what I have steered away from is rumors. There's gossip that this person did this or whatever. That is not provable. If it's not provable, then it doesn't make my research book. What goes in is facts. From there, the client or campaign can determine how they want to use that, if they want to use it at all. So a lot of times, some of the worst stuff involving a candidate or whatnot is not included or never used. The public never finds out about some of the worst stuff out there because that candidate maybe didn't need to do it because some other stuff ended the campaign. And I'll give you a good example of that.
Yes, please.
A good example of that would have been in the 2008 Missouri governor's race. There was some information out there regarding one of the candidates that was very devastating, but the candidate ended up leaving the race, so the public never was made aware of it.
All right. But now you say you don't report rumors because of the reasons that you mentioned, but if your client says, Chris, I want the rumors, I want everything you get, whether you could validate it or not, what's your response?
My response is that I'm gonna take the rumors. I'm going to track them down with as much factual basis as possible, and then I'm going to include in that if a client says to me that I'm going to include in there whether it is factually based or sound. And if it's not, then I typically let my clients know that I'm not that there is this out there, but there is no merit to it. Uh, Basically, in a nutshell, steer away from it because it could actually blow up in your face.
Right. But in other words, you're not going to pass moral judgment on what to include. You're working for your client. They're paying you to get whatever it is they're asking you to get, and it's up to you to report it, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And are you, or do Oppo researchers ever engage or on a regular basis in illegal activities?
No, well, I shouldn't say that there probably are people out there that do, but the overwhelming majority of folks do not.
What kind of illegal activities would you suspect they engage in to get some of the dirt?
Well, in a lot has changed with the rise of technology. So hacking, for example, cyber theft, illegal spying, things of the sort like
hacking emails, right?
hacking, burglary, robbery, those kinds of things. You obviously Watergate being probably the most famous of all of them. That
Right.
It does happen, but the caliber folks tend to stay away from it.
All right, so tell us, what are some of the legal things that you and other Oppo researchers look at to get the information on the other opponent, or at least the information that you're looking for?
So when you're facing a client, what I immediately do is, quite honestly, put together the basic portfolio. Who are they? What do they do for a living? Where do they live? Are they married? Do they have kids? Have they ever been divorced? The basic picture profile. From there, you go down a whole number of holes: taxes, properties, um, divorce records. You can go through the whole deal. So some of the legal avenues, obviously, voting records, pulling tax records, pulling court files. Those are just some examples of some legal things that that researchers easily do and always do when they're involved in a high-profile race.
So you pull someone's tax records, what would you be looking for?
I'm looking for a couple of things. One, I'm looking for whether or not it's in their name. If because there are sometimes there has been instances of folks that have properties maybe that they live in that are paid for by special interests. So that's the first thing you're looking at. Whether they're behind on taxes is the obvious. Do they have back taxes? That is an immediate disqualifier for a candidate to run for office in most areas. So because of that, you can remove somebody from the ballot. And then if they are current on their taxes, do they have a habit of paying those taxes late?
Okay. Again, just going after their character and their compliance with the state and local laws, an indication of who they are, right?
Yes. So there's also some instances. I think we're probably going to get to this in a little bit,
Right.
but there's some
Yes, we will.
instances where that rabbit hole will take you to other properties, which may open a case up in a whole different direction than you ever expected.
Right, and we'll get to that in a second. So you look for divorces, and you see they're divorced. Do you go to the ex-spouse and ask questions?
So that is a interesting dynamic there and a little bit of a dilemma. The answer to that question is yes. If you have somebody who maybe has a relationship with that individual, then yes, you would use that relationship to get information, ideally. But most of the time, that's not the case, and that's kind of a last case scenario in that you want to make sure you get all the things that are provable first.
Interesting.
Then you can get to the spouse.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris, but I find that interesting because I'm just thinking as an FBI agent, if I was trying to find out something about somebody, try to get an informant on them, you find out about an ex-spouse, man, we run right out there because you think it's someone who's someone's been cheated upon or hurt. We want maybe it's a female that he's beaten up or something like that, and boy, and you get someone who's really angry and they've been an intimate partner. There's a lot of information they may be willing to give you. I find that as a very rich source. May be distasteful, but it certainly is legal. And is there anything that prohibits you from doing that on an ethical standard?
So there is a little bit of a line on that, in that the difference between a researcher and a private investigator. And so, in those instances, you would want to hire, the campaign, it would be an additional expense, but you would hire a licensed private investigator
I see.
to conduct that research. versus an actual researcher who does not have that appropriate license.
Okay, so you're more right, and that's a very good separation you make there between the two. We're going to take questions that come in, Chris. First question that came in is, when does Oppo research cross the line from legal to illegal? And let me just say what I think, then you could jump in here, but that'd be clearly whether you're breaking the law or not, because law, as a general rule, doesn't have an ethical standard. It doesn't say we think this is wrong. Either you're prohibited from doing something, or you're not. So as you said, if you hack somebody, you break into their house, clearly that's illegal. But I think maybe some of the blurred lines would be if it's someone you're close to, even like a married couple, if someone's to go to a spouse and say, check their emails. They may have access to the emails. It's sitting there on the computer, but is it legal to do it in behalf of somebody else? Well, what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, there is a little bit of a line there that you got to be careful of. The instance you gave where somebody has access to those emails, and accesses those emails without permission, that is a very dangerous line. You want to hesitate. It's not to say that people probably in the industry wouldn't go that route. There are folks that probably would, and then what they do is they probably print those out and get a hard copy versus a digital copy, and so they can prove that.
Right.
But I would probably steer clear of that because there's not under the law much difference between hacking and illegal and somebody without a permission accessing that email account.
Now, again, you drew a distinction between being a researcher, being a private eye. Private eye, private detective, private investigator, and just about every state I know of is a regulated industry. You have to be licensed. With those licenses come rules and regulations. Is there any licensing for Oppo research, and are there any written rules and regulations? Does anyone have any oversight?
No.
That's pretty simple. So, code of ethics. There is no written code of ethics. Do you have an unwritten code of ethics, just amongst yourselves or each other?
It's changed a little bit. The rise of social media, the rise of immediate news, right, has changed the industry quite a bit. So it used to be that it had to be provable. Now it just needs to be enough to make them, the old Tip O'Neill saying, call them a child molester and make them defend that they're not. We're seeing this kind of in the instance of Roy Moore in Alabama, where folks are coming out of the woodworks now 40 years later. There's not a ton of concrete evidence in that, but the fact that he's having to go on the defense has hurt him. So the rise
wait,
of
hold
social
on.
media.
Hold on. You threw the meat out there. I'm biting. So you're bringing up Roy Moore. You're bringing up these. Are you saying that these allegations are not credible? They sound to you like just people putting them out there for political reasons only?
Not saying that they're not credible. There's definitely I would not doubt the credibility of the individuals that are making the allegations. What I'm stating is, in the past, there typically had to be concrete evidence to provide to your traditional media outlets before they would report something like that. In today's media, even if the concrete evidence lacks, they still will report it via social media. Some outlet somewhere, whether a blogger or a mainstream cable network, will report it on social media, and it will take a leg of its own.
That's a good point you mentioned, because I've been playing with the idea of dedicating an episode to ethics in the media. What they should and shouldn't do in today's environment. And I think you just pushed me over the edge of trying to get that, and maybe we'll get a reporter from mainstream media to join us and discuss that. Let's talk about social media for a second. One of the questions that would come up to me, you could look at someone's Facebook postings and whatnot, and again, and this might be a little bit of a difference between a researcher and a PI, but there's nothing wrong with looking at publicly available information, right? What they put out there and using that for lead material.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're running for office, or if you're applying for a job, or if you're doing anything in life, what you post is now public record. And you have to fully expect that it will be held against you in any way, shape, or form, whether you're applying for a job, whether you're running for office, your court cases, if you're in a divorce, child custody case, you name it, it's going to be used against you.
And now, it's interesting, recently, now that you mentioned Roy Moore, we saw, I think it was a Washington Post detected that someone was trying to provide false information on Roy Moore. Did you see that? A female claiming
Yeah.
that okay, and they caught on that it was some sort of setup they were trying to do. What about using social media again as a pretext? Someone trying to seduce someone, coming on social media as somebody else, pretending to be an attractive female trying to seduce a male. Is that beyond the pale of what you? Not when I say you, I don't mean you personally. Is that beyond the pale of Oppo research to see if the person is, of certain character, using a pretext, or is that again something most of you would consider unethical?
I, I'll be honest with you. I think that does that happen? I think the term for it's kind of catfishing. Does that happen? It absolutely does happen. I don't think most opposition researchers would do that because they are paid to compile a book of facts and they have only a limited time to put that together. That's a little bit more of a campaign operative aspect. So are there people out there, let's use the example of what you were talking about there with Project Veritas, are there campaign operatives out there that are their job is to stir drama or to stir issues? Absolutely. Those people are different than opposition researchers. Opposition researchers.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, finish your thought. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, opposition researchers' jobs are to put the book together, put the facts together, and then go down, and then from there the campaign can hire those individuals if they'd like. That's something that we're not involved in typically.
Yeah, I like a term you just used. 'Cause I'm going to, we were talking, you and I earlier, about any historical basis, the origins of Oppo research. And I started doing some research on it. I couldn't find much, all right, about it. Just a lot, someone could always talk about, Sun Tzu and the Art of War and how much he talks about spying on your enemies. But I got this, I was reading this book here, We're With Nobody, about Oppo research, to get myself familiar with it. I'm going to refer to this book in a second. But the author, Mr. Huffman here, is quoted in an article I pulled off the internet where he was asked about historical origins of opposition research. And he mentions here that it looks back to the Roman days when it was not unusual for the senators to spy on each other. And then he talked about another case here using Oppo research on the presidential election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson used this, what would you be called an Oppo researcher, back then was called a scandal monger. So that would fit into what you were just describing now, would you not? A scandal monger?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's campaign operatives that are scandal mongers. I guess that'd be a great term for them.
I love that term. It's catchy.
Their job is to cause chaos. Their job is to cause scandals and to put things out there. That's not that's not the same thing as an opposition researcher.
Right. Now let's go to some of the next questions. If you can, I think we could answer this one quickly. If you can pull tax records, and I want to get more to what records you do pull and stuff. If you can pull tax records, why did people not get Trump's taxes? I think when you talk about records, you're talking about property tax records, things that are public documents, not income tax. Do you want to
that's right.
Take that?
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, accessing IRS records is without permission or authority is obviously illegal. What we're talking about is property tax records.
Right.
And in some instances, financial records that would be provided by elected officials on financial disclosure statements.
Right, and that is public information. Just look, when I was with the FBI, 2 points. One, sometimes you go into a file, and we would have, through subpoena, somebody's IRS records. That is covered up within the files, sort of tape over. It doesn't mean, an unscrupulous agent couldn't open up and look at it, but it was some control to warn an agent, you are not entitled to that information, even though we were doing it within the scope of a legitimate criminal investigations. People's income taxes, as in our society, always been well protected. Would you agree with that concept?
Yes, and rightfully so. It should be.
Right, and also, again, I had to do financial disclosure forms when I got in the senior executive service of the FBI. Pretty boring. As it should be for an FBI agent, but we had to do them, and we took them very seriously. I remember one year getting called from the office saying there was something inconsistent in my reporting from one year to the next. And as you can imagine, my disclosures are nothing like Jared Kushner's. All right, but we took it pretty seriously. You had to make sure it was right, even though I really had nothing to hide. Though I will tell you this: one time when I was SAC, Special Agent in Charge, a case came across my desk of a company. I owned a big 200 shares of stock in that company, common stockholder, and I still asked that I not get any information about that case. I recuse myself from that. Again, these are the things you do just to keep it clean. All right. Let's go to the next question. So how do people know if things are true? Example, the Trump dossier, which you and I are going to talk about, Janet. We will discuss that. So, Chris, how do people know when things are true? We can't, can we?
I guess the question I would have is who's the people? Is that the people in the public or the researcher? So our job is on the research side is to put together as much of a factual basis and argument as possible. Now, I will say that we also look for what I would call red meat or potentially things that could be used or in some ways distorted to impact that opponent. So it may be, let me use an example here. Somebody works for Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo's tied to fraud. Therefore, this person's tied to fraud, right? So that's where the public has a hard time trying to figure out what's true. We see this in commercials all the time, where I think we saw last year in a Republican primary in Missouri, where the candidates were trying to tie each other to communist China, right? And that's a similar instance. How do we know it's true? The public, quite frankly, has to do their own research and their own and looking into it. And the truth of the matter is that's why opposition research is such a commodity in high-profile races, is because the public doesn't have time. Quite honestly, I would say they also don't really care to look for whether or not something is true or not.
And nor do they have the knowledge.
That's right. They don't have the time. We live a busy life. They don't have the knowledge of where to go look to find the facts. Those campaigns know that. They're micro-targeting down to specific people that would buy that information without that would accept that information without having to do thorough research anyway.
Now, you mentioned something before. Who was it? The politician said, "Call them a pedophile and let them prove it's not true." Right? Something to that effect. Yeah. Okay, but if everyone does that, and it may work for somebody, but we're living in a society now without, again, not trying to take a political position here, but where the truth has become pretty questionable, right? Where it's become almost have no value. If we continue to do that, and by we I mean politicians, people that we have to trust, people that we have to put our faith in to lead us down the right path. If we get to a point where all they're doing is spewing out what could be bull, where do we fall as a society? What's going to happen to the fabric of our society if we just can't believe anybody anymore? Where are we leading? Where does that head us?
That hurts our democracy. And I think we're seeing that play out in a very large scale across the country in today's politics. I think this is why, if you look at any major mainstream poll, Congress, politicians in D.C. have the lowest ratings since the Civil War. And I think you also see that there is a significant lack of trust in the mainstream media now. And it's because of this very instance playing out. It's very dangerous for society to just constantly, for the media outlets and others to constantly put this information out there with no factual basis. Because then when there is very serious scandals or very serious issues that have come about, the public is less likely to buy it. And that could be very dangerous.
So the Chicken Little syndrome, right?
That's correct.
And yeah, it is very dangerous, and the truth should not be taken lightly. Let's go to the next question. Oppo research can be anything these days, right? People can just make up whatever they want, and some shady net news station can run it, and other credible news will run with it. Those kind of some of the things you were saying, Chris, but go ahead. Why don't you take that?
I disagree with that. I think that again it goes back to an opposition researcher and a muckraker or scandal monger, like you had referred to. There are a lot of folks on Twitter on both sides of the political aisle that take little information, throw it out there, and just muddy the waters. That's different than an opposition researcher. An opposition researcher is somebody who's hired to compile a book for that candidate, either for someone they're running against, and even in some instances, you're usually hired to compile a book on the candidate that pays you. Because they want to know what is out there that their opponent may find, and the best way to protect yourself is to have somebody do all the dig all the dirt on yourself, so that you're prepared as a campaign for what may come your way.
Right. Did you see the movie Primary Colors?
Yes,
Okay.
with
I,
John Travolta,
John
right?
Travolta, right, exactly, playing supposedly Clinton, I believe it was. There's a scene there where I believe it was his party does their Oppo research. They come up with something very damning about the opposition, but they pay him a visit and they say, look, we found it. Someone else is going to find it. We don't want to use it against you. We just want to warn you that it's coming. Make your own decision. How real is that? How
Very real.
compassionate? It is real.
It's done in every high profile campaign that may be competitive. So we're gonna come up on the midterm elections. There's going to be a dozen or more races that are going to be that are going to determine whether or not a party controls the Senate or not, or Congress, for example. 24 races, I think, will determine that. Those races will all have a researcher do self candidate research. They will determine everything possible that's out there, and then they will have their talking points put together heading into that campaign so that they are ready for any of the bad news that comes their way.
Right, but in terms of actually approaching the opponent privately and saying, look what we found, and we're giving this to you for your own protection, that sounds a little too high and mighty for what I see going on. I don't see that being as realistic.
Um, I'm trying to remember that scene. Did they approach the opponent, or did they approach the actual
Yes, they
candidate
approached the
themselves?
opponent. I think either that he had an affair or his wife had an affair or something like that, and they said, well, if we found that someone else is going to find it, we just don't want you, being humiliated by this. And he was so grateful. I'm like, I don't think we're quite, we're all that ethical.
What happens in the real world is that information is put out there, and typically there is an ambassador of sorts that
Right.
they know that is friends with maybe that candidate, and they will send them to sit down and say, hey, listen, for your best interest, you probably should step out of this one. And that did happen in the 2008 Missouri governor's race.
Right. But is it really out of some sense of decency, or is it just trying to push the other person out?
It's both. I mean,
Really?
I think it's out of it. It's out of a little bit of a sense of decency, but it's also to win.
Right. Well, I like to hear that at least there's some sense of decency left. All right. I don't know if I'm the only one doubting that. Let's get to some more questions. Who commissions Oppo research, the media or the opponent?
So this is interesting. It used to be the opponent or a candidate or organization, special interest, that would commission that opposition research. We are now seeing in today's climate media organizations and new media organizations paying opposition researchers. So Breitbart News, for example, I think it was Breitbart, or I'm sorry, no, it was the Federalist paper, was involved in the original Fusion 360 campaign. That they were one of the original outlets that
The Free
hired
Beacon,
Fusion 360
the
or
Washington
Fusion
Free Beacon.
GPS.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, Fusion GPS. I'm sorry, and
Right.
it was them and Jeb Bush's campaign that commissioned them originally. So that's a media outlet that did hire opposition researchers. So today's politics, every outlet's doing it.
But you would think mainstream media would be pretty good at this themselves, that they wouldn't have to outsource this.
Yes, you would think. This is why the Trump dossier is so interesting in the way that it's played out, because mainstream media typically would be pretty good at that. But when it gets to the real gritty stuff, I think that resources sometimes are thin in today's climate with newspapers and whatnot. And I think that at that point they would probably hire somebody.
Just a matter of practicality. All right, let's go. Okay, someone asked the question, aren't tax returns public records? And the answer is no. I think we've answered that. They are not. They're very well protected. Reggie asks, so the only Oppo research ethics are personal. Doesn't that encourage false information? Good question.
Uh, it does it can encourage false information if you have somebody who is in some ways unethical. Now, the definition of false information is also a very loose definition, right? If I take information that shows that this individual is tied to an organization that may have done some unethical behavior, is that necessarily false? No, it's not false. but is it false that that individual probably had something to do with it? That may be obviously a false statement, but you'll never see them say this person had something to do with it. You'll always see an article that says, or an advertisement that says this person worked for Wells Fargo. Let me give you an example. I don't know if folks remember former Mayor Kay Barnes in Kansas City when she ran for Congress, and there was these ads that had said she worked for a magazine company, and that magazine company was also the same publisher of Penthouse. So there was these ads that were showing her tied to Penthouse magazine. The truth of the matter is she had nothing to do with Penthouse, but it planted the seed of doubt, and that's all that mattered.
Right. Very good. Okay, Robin asks, isn't it encouraged to make up things these days? Social media allows people to see the initial report, but no one checks or sees a retraction. Chris?
Yes, honestly, today social media has changed the way politics and opposition research works. So there's a lot of people out there doing what's called doxing. So they're putting out public information on individuals that are sometimes private individuals. That's costing people's jobs, for example, just for being tied, just for going to a protest or a rally. Those kinds of things do encourage behavior that, quite honestly, I think crosses the line.
You know, talking about crossing the line, when you go out there and you say, you research public documents and you may, speak to someone, as you said, there might be a PI doing that, a little on the edge there. But when you look at the definition of a private investigator in many states, that type of work, checking on someone's lifestyle, doing a background on someone, that's sort of their legislative definition that makes them required to get a license. Not that different than what you're doing. Should opposition researchers be regulated? Should they be licensed or regulated? So there is some code of ethics.
I think that would be an interesting road to go down. Do I personally think that? I don't personally think that. I think that the regulations on private investigators I think, meet that requirement. But in today's politics, it is becoming a little bit more cutthroat, and it is starting to blur a line. So I think it's going to be a debate that we're going to have in the years to come. But it's always kind of been around there, people have always known it, and politicians would avoid that because most of them are hiring an opposition researcher.
Right. Let me read something here. We're talking about the ethics of where things stand. Again, this is, the book that I've got, to kind of understand this a little bit better. And here the author writes this. He says, through negative campaigning, it is often perceived as a bane of politics, which we like to think of ourselves as seekers of the truth. In our view, documenting that truth is more crucial than ever. When today's news is prone to distortion, willful ignorance, and lies, when untruths go viral in the blogosphere overnight, and even conventional media sources give airtime and print space to erroneous claims and rumors, when the headline of a local story, I'm going to skip over that, and then he says, truth is a word that should never be qualified. It's like pregnancy. It's yes or no. It's possible to inculcate the public with untruths or distortions, but as Senator David Patrick Moynihan reportedly once observed, everyone is entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts. I think that's kind of consistent with what you've been saying, right?
That's right. So one of the biggest concerns that I have, just on the outside looking in many ways, is the mainstream media is supposed to be the fourth estate in a democracy or republic, and I think we're starting to see journalism move away from journalism to opinion editorializing the news, right? So so-called journalists are now all of a sudden giving their opinions constantly on Twitter, and so what it does is it starts to muddy the water, and then you have staffers, these new media outlets like thehill.com, or you could fill in the blank, reporting that a former Obama staffer or a former Bush staffer says this. Well, is that really news? Does it really matter, right? So what it does is it begins to muddy the waters. It begins to build distrust in the public, and unfortunately, it creates an environment where anything goes. And I think we're seeing in 2017 the results of years and years and years of that happening. We're now seeing play out in 2017, where many of the things that people thought would be taboo or things you should stay away from in politics are suddenly happening in their mainstream and they're being accepted by the public.
Right. Now, Chris, what I just read to you from this book sounds very timely, does it not?
It does. It does. It is very timely. Like I said, 2017 is a year that is going to change the way politics is talked about for years to come.
Right.
And I think social media has a big play in it. I mean, people have to forget this. I mean, people seem to forget this. Donald Trump is truly the first president of the United States with social media. Barack Obama, his second term, social media started to become big, but Donald Trump's the first real social media president, and we're seeing the impact of the politics around it.
Right. Just by the way, this book was published in 2012. All right, not that long ago, but sounds a little prescient, does it not?
Well, yeah, I think 2012, the first generation iPhone was basically the second generation iPhone. Twitter I think Twitter had just been created, maybe. So now we have all these social media platforms, one of which we're on right now, and you're starting to see the impact on politics. Yeah, so it is a timely book, and the quote I think rings true today.
Right, very interesting. All right, let's go. Do Oppo researchers use Reddit? Chris, I can't answer that one. What do you think?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. That's a good example of social media changing politics. So what an opposition researcher would do would be to do a global search on anything that pulls up online regarding your target. And if there is a Reddit link that says, so and so ran over a dog on this day, then they absolutely would run that down and see if there's any validity. Was there a ticket? Were they arrested for it? And Reddit has impacted politics, and I would argue it's going to impact politics in the years to come.
Interesting. And the same person asks, what would you do if you became in possession of illegally obtained information?
Well, if you're in possession of illegally obtained information, the immediate thing would be to give it to it, notify or give it to the authorities.
Let me just point something out again, not to argue the Russiagate. We've had a couple of episodes on that already. But when people talk about what is collusion and how would collusion work, it would be if you and I, or let's say you had hacked emails, right, and they were illegally obtained, and I knowingly used them, or I encouraged you to get me more, and we're colluding about that, which is just another word for conspiring, that would be illegal. Because if I'm taking it's like taking possession of stolen property, right? If I am participating in that activity and I'm knowing it, or I'm turning a blind eye to it, I too am guilty of a crime. And I think you would agree with that, Chris, right?
That's correct, but this again is where technology blurs the line in politics today. So let's use the example that you were just using on emails, hacked emails. So there is no doubt that the DNC emails, for example, were hacked and released by WikiLeaks. Once they were released, they're fair game. They're in the public now.
Correct.
And they're fair game to be used. So if campaigns were involved in that hacking and then using that information, that obviously would violate the law. But if they obtain those emails via WikiLeaks.com or .org or whatever the site is, then that is not in violation
Correct.
of law.
But if I'm talking to WikiLeaks and I'm saying, okay, this is how we're going to do it, all right, I'm going to announce this and you're going to release this, then that is conspiracy.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Another question, and time is going well here. Do political parties Oppo research on their own candidates? You answered that question already. You said yes, they do, just to figure out what the other person is going to find. One of the things I think about, which is not really Oppo research, but remember the great statement, I know John Kennedy. John Kennedy was a friend of mine. And Senator, you know John Kennedy. Do you remember that one, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of people, depending on how old you are, will remember that. That wasn't really Oppo research, but it did come from researching his opposition and knowing that he was going to bring up that comparison between him and John F. Kennedy. Right? And so by knowing what the other person does, to be forewarned is to be forearmed, right?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, you definitely want to know as much as you can about your opponent and also about your candidate. So if you're a campaign manager, You're being paid this money. Your reputation's on the line. You definitely want to budget in research on your candidate because you're representing a brand. And for a lot of these campaign managers out there, they take on a candidate. They want to win, and if that race blows up, that could impact their entire career as a company or organization. And so they want to know as much information as possible. And yeah,
Well, it's just like I think about sports. You always watch the other team. You watch your competition, especially sports that are one-on-one, tennis, boxing, things like that. You watch their moves, and if you're gonna debate somebody, watch their debates. Watch what terms they like to use, their body language. You know how they give off the signals, the tells, and use that to your advantage. Now we could think of a lot of other examples. I know Reagan used it, and George Bush used them effectively just by doing oppo research, not looking for dirt, but just looking for the tendencies and things that they give away during a debate.
absolutely. And this is where opposition research is truly, in many ways, the most effective. Because in larger races where debates matter in some aspect, they're going to sit there in a room. The opposition researcher, part of their job is not just to compile the book, but to sit there in the room with a pollster and with the campaign manager and with the candidate and usually the communications director, and they are going to coach that individual on how to debate their opponent and the talking points to use. So, for example, did that guy vote for a $23 million tax increase or something like that? Well, then we want to pull that out and use that. And so that's all going to go into play hand in hand. And then the other thing is to use that opposition research and then also incorporate it into your polling so that you can learn the voting habits. Because the other thing that comes into play in those debates is not just the information you've obtained, but do they really care about it? The public sometimes, and I should say a lot of times, does not care about information that maybe us as a political operative would think really matters. The public may not really care about it. And I think we're going to probably see this play out a little bit in the Alabama Senate race, where clearly there's some very serious allegations that have taken place. But the question is, at the end of the day, will the general populace really care when they go to the voting booth?
Right, and it's very interesting you mentioned that because, and I've watching mainstream media cover that, they'll tell you, oh, in the polls, Roy Moore, has lost so many points, he's 8 points behind. But if you talk to the man on the street in Alabama, most of them saying, I don't care. I want to vote Republican. I want to keep Roy Moore in. So we have that dichotomy again, right?
That's right. So there was a poll by Gravis Marketing, who I think is one of the best pollsters in the country, and Gravis Marketing had a poll they released, and it showed Roy Moore down 5 points, but mainstream media reported Roy Moore's down 5 points. What I looked at was the numbers. Okay, what I saw was Roy Moore had actually gained a percentage, and 6 points had moved from Doug Jones to the undecided block. What that told me was Roy Moore had weathered the worst. And now the voting habits are starting to line back up just like they do in a partisan aspect. So then because of that, you then saw politically calculated moves by Donald Trump and by others on talking heads on mainstream media that began talking about Doug Jones as a weak on crime, weak on illegal immigration, high taxes candidate, because they knew the voters were moving back to their partisan directions, and as long as they hit those talking points, they saw the move going back to Roy Moore. There's now polls that I just saw a poll yesterday that showed Roy Moore up 2 points, so he's actually weathered the worst and now taken a lead. So I think you're going to start to see that line up in Alabama.
Paul, is he going to win?
Come
on, be bold. Be bold.
I do believe Roy Moore is going to win. I believe Roy Moore is going to win by probably 5 points. And the reason I believe that is because I do fundamentally believe, and not to get too political on this aspect, 'cause I know we said we're going to avoid it, but I do believe on a partisan end that the Democratic Party brand in Alabama and in other rural areas is broken. And I think that they have a long way to go to restore that. And I think if there's anything worse than a 30-year-old hitting on a teenager, it's probably an ultra liberal in Alabama.
I don't think what you're saying is very partisan. I think that's just a reality. So I don't think that was ultra political at all. Let's see. Is Oppo research dangerous to the researcher? Well, I mean, you don't go out there and approach people, but has an Oppo researcher ever been threatened for the information he or she has found out?
Yeah. So
Really?
I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I have absolutely.
Okay. And I know of other times when you've been threatened for things you're trying to find out the truth.
That's
Right?
right. That's exactly right.
I'm
Yeah. I
personally
mean,
aware of that.
it does come at a cost. I mean, I think anytime you're in a high stakes matchup and somebody has something to lose and they know you have the information, there is a risk there.
What is done with Oppo research when it is completed? Media needs to. Okay, let's break this down again. All right, what is done with Oppo research when the research is completed? I guess you said that goes to the party and the candidate and the campaign, and they must decide what to do with it. Correct?
That's correct. So a book's compiled with an index, and it talks about all the documents. And in a court, if it involves court cases, it has not the entire court case, but the parts that matter, and it's all condensed, and it's put together. A good opposition research book is then it identifies the key points that matter, and it puts it together with talking points that can be used in the favor of that evidence, and it's given to the candidate.
All right. Now, so she says, no, John. I think John says the media needs two sources to corroborate. Does Oppo research need anything like that, or is it just I heard this? So let's break this down. First of all, you're saying that you, at least in your work as an Oppo researcher, you're not going to report something I just heard, right? You're going to corroborate it and put some factual basis to it. Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, this issue, media needs two sources to corroborate. Do you know if that's an unwritten rule in the media?
No. Oh, in the media?
Yeah, media.
In the media, I don't know if that's an unwritten rule or not, but I do know that they will ask for some factual basis, at least one good source. I don't know that. I think two sources is probably your traditional media outlets. And the new media outlets, meaning websites, today's politics, one source probably gets something reported.
Right. I know there's a lot of fuss out there. Oh, the media, they don't care. They just report things. But, at least in the limited exposure I've had with the media and what I understand, there is some self-policing that goes on, at least, major networks, and major being the local networks as well, not just the national networks. Because when someone is caught to be lying, as we've seen before, they pay a very heavy price to that, do they not?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're seeing that play out on the national media scene in some ways with this Project Veritas deal recently, where the individual, went and tried to portray himself as a victim to kind of fool the Washington Post reporter. You saw that. You saw it play out with Brian Williams, a very respected NBC analyst, and he lost his career and then restarted it again. So you are seeing it play out, absolutely.
Right. Just going to two sources. Look, even in the FBI, we didn't count on two sources. Sometimes there just aren't two sources. But it's a matter of taking the information, looking at the credibility of the one source, and again, looking for corroboration. So someone can say something, and we may believe it or not believe it, but if we can't get any evidence to back it up, it doesn't go anywhere. So
this is my issue with the Trump dossiers.
Okay, let's get to that. Let's get to the Trump dossier. I got it right here. Let's go. Come on, let's do it. All right.
This is my issue with the Trump dossier because I have a couple issues with this, but this is a part of it is because as you read through the dossier, it's source A, source B, source whatever. It doesn't identify the individual, and the media just runs off of that, and they don't have any source. They don't have the information, and I think that's a little bit of a dangerous precedence. But yes, that's a good example of how much that's decreased. That qualification by the mainstream media decreases the trust.
Well, let's look at that because, and I want to talk about the dossier in a sense. Look, even when I was in law enforcement and we presented affidavits to arrest people and to bring the trial, a lot greater consequences than just making statements to the media. We didn't identify our sources. Sometimes you just can't identify sources, but it's a matter of the credibility of the sources, the credibility of the reporter. In that case, it would be an agent, and whether the other information supports it. Did you ever produce anything where your sources were not identified?
I never produced anything where the sources were not identified. No.
Because you see where, even like in the media, they have to protect their sources, right? I mean, we can't always reveal our sources.
Well, the media absolutely should protect their sources, and law enforcement absolutely should protect their sources. I mean, it can get very dangerous. To use an example, in Kansas City, the case with Gilbert Dowdy, here just locally in Kansas City, where high-profile individuals were involved. I mean, that's one example where sources are critical to be protected. But on opposition research end of things, this is why I have concerns with the Trump dossier, is because mainstream media took this document that did not identify sources and reported it as fact in many ways. Now they've used the words allegations or whatnot, but by promoting it and talking about it constantly, the general public began to take that as fact, and I think that's very dangerous precedent. In the other part of that is that as you read through the documents, you'll see source A and it'll identify them as maybe a Russian intelligence officer. Where at that point we're also talking about federal laws and coordinating with foreign governments to impact an election. That's not really being talked about in the past. Now it's coming back to haunt mainstream media.
Well, I'm not sure I followed that point and why that would haunt mainstream media, that last point. But I read this. So when you read this, what's your first take? It's all bull? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I'm not saying it's all necessarily bull. I'm just saying when you read through it, there's a lot of information in there that's not corroborated with fact. It's,
right, and again, as someone who was just he was commissioned first by Republicans, to get this information, but it is partisan because they work a competition. I read this. First of all, I look at it and it just has the feel of an intelligence officer report. Now you may not have seen that, but having read these myself many times, so yeah, I can see where an intelligence officer, had done that. Again, you look like you want to say something.
Absolutely, and that's exactly where I was kind of going with it. There's a difference between opposition research and intelligence, and clearly this was an intelligence document. This was an intelligence officer taking all the information that he could obtain from sources that individual Christopher Steele had built over the years. So he clearly felt like he could trust the source that it was coming from, and that's okay. But when you're talking about an election, you're talking about using information that was obtained from a foreign government official to then
hold on. Time out. He's not a foreign government official. He's an ex-retired, government. You could come to me right now, and I get hired a lot, Chris, as you know, to do, investigative work. I'm not an FBI agent anymore. I don't use I don't have any access to FBI information. If I call up the FBI office and say, hey, can you tell me something? They're hanging up on me real quick. All right? Other than the fact they just may not like me. All right? So, and we have Israeli intelligence agents who are probably making a lot of money. I know they are because I met many of them, making a lot of money here in the States just because of their expertise. So that's not using a foreign agent. If Steele was no longer an agent, I have to disagree with you. That's not using an agent of a foreign power.
No, I'm not saying Christopher Steele's a foreign agent. I'm saying Christopher Steele gathered his information using foreign agents. And so at that point, he is coordinating with a foreign entity, foreign intelligence officers, to obtain information about a candidate that was running for president of the United States. He then put that information into a report and gave it to the organizations that paid him, in this instance, numerous organizations. And that information was reported as fact and went to impact the election. In my personal opinion, I don't believe that is much different than WikiLeaks hacking emails, obtaining them, and then using that to impact the election. I see this as a Russian operation and foreign government operation that muddied our waters on both sides of the aisle in many ways. And I think that it's coming back. It's going to be a very big story in the year to come as to who was paid and what government agents were used in that dossier to impact the election.
Right. Well, I think you're kind of saying two different things, because I agree with you 100% that the Russians interfering with our election is a really big deal, irrespective of what anyone thinks it did or did not impact and whatever the goal were. I think it is a big deal. I don't know that I equate that to WikiLeaks, which is a different set of circumstances, which was illegal. hacking is illegal, and if someone did use that information, or as I said, turn a blind eye and encourage that, that is criminality on the part of American citizens. So I think there's a little bit of a difference, but I agree with you in terms of the impact. Now, when I read this thing here, and I don't think this has gotten as much attention as I thought it would have gotten, given all that's in here. But one of the first things it says that Trump declined various sweetener real estate business that was offered to him. I mean, that's kind of a positive statement about Trump. I don't think anyone should be, any Trump supporters should be offended by that.
No, I don't. I think there's certainly information in there that that helps Trump, that he declined these sweeteners.
Yeah.
And I think it's backed up by statements that have been presented in front of the Intelligence Committee as leaked out or reported in mainstream media, where his bodyguard also said, I think when they offered escorts to his hotel room, according to his bodyguard, he said Trump's not that kind of guy.
Right.
And so I think some of that information does help Trump. There's obviously information that hurts Trump. My point in this is, if you look at those paragraphs, all of them are obtained from Russian or foreign intelligence officers. And at that point, they're coordinating with, at that point, money from a campaign has been paid to an individual to coordinate with a foreign government official. That violates federal law, and that at that point becomes a very serious issue.
So this is have to go all the way back to the original purchase of this document, which was, according to you, whom? Who were the original ones that started this?
So that's the interesting part about it is, the Federalist paper and Jeb Bush's campaign started it, but it appears that once Hillary Clinton and the DNC got involved, that's when Fusion GPS hired Christopher Steele to begin to acquire a little bit more of this information, from what I've read.
But Steele's not American. Steele's not an American citizen, right?
No, he's not. He's a former, I think, British spy, an intelligence officer. And the problem I have with that is he went to the Ukraine embassy. Individuals went to the Ukraine embassy, worked with Ukrainian intelligence. They worked with Russian intelligence officers to acquire this information. At that point, they're coordinating with the foreign government. The folks on the Democratic side of the aisle may not like the fact that I'm saying that, but the bottom line is you can't argue on one side that Trump was coordinating with a foreign government by his son or whoever meeting with a Russian intelligence officer at a meeting with other intelligence agents. At the same point, campaign money being used to hire somebody to go gather information from intelligence officers in Russia to be used in a campaign. It's the exact same thing in many ways. I would argue it's probably worse. Donald Trump Jr. Met with individuals. I don't know that there's proof yet that he knew that there was intelligence operation happening inside that room. I think that there is proof that money was used to transfer to Fusion GPS, who then went in and used information from intelligence officers of foreign governments. I think that's more damning, and I think it's going to come out in the months to come.
Okay, we got 2 minutes. I want to get to more questions, but since you took that position, we will put out there you are a Trump supporter, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, let's just get that out there also. All right, since we're going to get a little. All right, Billy Boy wants to know: wouldn't a political campaign do something like use an outside group to find Oppo research that they can have plausible deniability, which I think is pretty much what you're saying was done here, right?
Yeah. So absolutely, there's nothing wrong with hiring an outside group. My point is when you hire an outside individual. So let's just say Christopher Steele. They hire Christopher Steele. He does a traditional research document. There's nothing wrong with that. What happens though?
But let's say he never told. Let's say he never revealed that he was going to be going to foreign intelligence services. There would not be criminality then. If they turn a blind eye, but if they're not aware of his techniques, they just say, "Do what you can, get us research." Do you always tell people what you're going to do before you do it?
No, I don't. But the moment he starts to coordinate with foreign government officials, it becomes an intelligence operation versus an opposition research.
And it'd be illegal if the receiving party knew about it and either gave consent or he turned a blind eye to it.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Okay. Next question is there Oppo research done, for example, in the corporate world? I can say yes, it's called corporate espionage, and the FBI worked some of those as well. Those are illegal. Chris, any comments on that one?
Yeah, actually, we're seeing this play out. Actually, I think just yesterday, this story broke about Uber.
Mm-hmm.
and they had a specialized unit that was used to um, basically create espionage on Google's allegedly create espionage on Google's automated vehicle system, so that they could take the same information and technology and use it to build their company.
Right, intellectual property. Right.
That's right.
Chris, it's, hour's up. I want to thank you so much, buddy. You gave us such great insight. There's even more questions we couldn't get to, which means you really got some people thinking. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise, buddy. And I'll talk to you later.
As always, thanks, Mike.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions tonight. Um, Next week, we'll be talking about guns on campus. Do guns belong on schools? And as always, we'll have a pro and a con, and we'll duke it out in a civil manner. Please remember to go to Facebook and like us. And please, please, please go to YouTube and hit that little bell icon and be a subscriber. We need to reach 100 to increase our platforms that we could transmit to and broadcast on. So we really appreciate that. Another great audience tonight. We had good numbers, good questions. And I want to thank you for your time and continued support. And we'll see you next week on Crimes and Times. And from behalf of everyone here on the staff, good night.